I'm Jason Mitchell.
And I'm E.T. Mobley.
Welcome to today's episode of this Funkin Life podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the four most influential artists in the history of funk. So I think any conversation about funk has to begin with James Brown. He is the father of the whole thing, basically. In the mid-'60s, he changed his style up and came out with some heavily syncopated music that nobody had ever heard before. So, obviously you have tracks that set the table, like Papa's Got a Brand New Bag.
Yeah.
Even before that, you had Out of Sight. Both of those were kind of pointing in that direction, but it's kind of still based on 12-bar blues changes,
right.
With a different approach. Maybe it wasn't a shuffle rhythm, but soon after that, in 1967, he came out with Cold Sweat, and it was a whole new game.
Right.
And
I would have to say that the first thing to acknowledge about James is that he took showmanship to a whole nother level as well. So he made sure to have one of the tightest bands ever, but also he brought the act of dancing, the art of dancing, which influenced people like Michael Jackson, Justin Timberlake, you name it. And so showmanship was important to him.
Yeah. He was an all-around performer.
Right.
And after that track dropped, which was basically a single chord vamp with a super funky bass line, it had a beat to it. It's generally referred to as a boogaloo. And everybody wanted to get in on that because, first of all, it meant you just could make a song out of one chord and just groove on that. And if the rhythm was funky enough, people would get into it. It was just great for dancing. Right. And maybe there would be a change later in the song a couple of times just to break it up a little bit. But a lot of people were confused. Some of them were angry that you could do it like that. But he just did away with all the chord changes, the chord progressions. Didn't need a lot of melody. It was more about rhythm. Right. He used his voice in a rhythmic way, and it was all over that groove.
Yeah.
So
he really found a formula. Everything was in 4/4 measures, and his hits were always on the one, which really created this distinct sound for him.
A strong punch on the first beat, and then you'd fill in around that.
Absolutely.
Most of the time you'd have some instrumentation that was syncopated, which was off the beat, and that's where the funk came in.
Right.
Because you're setting the table on the one, but it's what happened after that made it funky.
The other thing I want to point out about James is that he really introduced this concept of horns, and also just really kind of making the horns almost like another voice, like a real focal point in the music.
Cold Sweat is a perfect example of that.
Exactly.
The horns were in there. It was a simple little two-note hook.
Right. Absolutely.
It just keeps coming back and forth. It gets in your head.
Yes.
So his songs were simplistic, but they were extremely catchy. And he would get on a good thing like that, and he would milk it. He would put out single after single. So after Cold Sweat came out, he got into this whole popcorn thing. Mother popcorn. It's a brand new day, so let a man come in and do the popcorn. Just on and on and on. So I think I calculated at one point in the late 60s, in a 2 or 3 year stretch, he put out 17 albums.
Right.
In 3 years. It was ridiculous.
Well, he earned the title of hardest working man in show business.
A lot of those albums had filler songs on them, but a lot of that stuff was great too.
Right.
So you had Mother Popcorn, and that was another hit, very similar to Cold Sweat.
Right.
But he took that into another place because you could not get enough of that rhythm.
Right.
So Cold Sweat hit in '67, and all the way through '69, he rode that popcorn thing, which was basically Cold Sweat, and he just kept finding new ways to interpret it. Maybe they would change a hit here or there, or the riff a little bit, but he got a lot of mileage out of that. And then in late 1969, going into '70, he had a new band of younger guys that featured Bootsy Collins and his brother and some other cats. And that's when the whole Sex Machine era happened for the next 18 months or so. And they just cranked out some of the most significant music in the history of funk. It had new energy.
Kudos to also the drummers in James Brown, Clyde Stubblefield and Jabal Starks. Really established that, again, that distinct James Brown sound.
Mm-hmm. So that late 60s, early 70s period was the most significant for the music of James Brown, and then for everybody that came after him, because it was so influential. Mm-hmm. So, all the groups that made their way in the 70s riding on his coattails, they were inspired. You always had that that cold sweat boogaloo thing in the back of your head.
Absolutely.
Without that, I don't think any of it's possible, because
Right,
it totally changed things around.
Right.
Before that, there wasn't anything like that.
Right.
So it seems like such a simple thing. When you listen to it, we just take it for granted now.
Right.
But it all has to do with that rhythm,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no exact predecessor that has that exact same feel.
Right.
So yeah, it really has a lot to do with the bass and the drums.
Right.
And then the other pieces that complemented that. I mean, every little piece is important.
Right. Right.
Whether
right.
it's the guitar chanks, it's the horn hits. Of course, you got James doing his thing on top of that.
Right.
But the main guy responsible for that was Pee Wee Ellis, his
Yes.
sax player and kind of musical director at the time.
Right.
This is before some of the other guys came in that were being influential in the 70s.
Right.
So that track is absolutely monumental. And that's why he has to be our starting point when we talk
absolutely.
about the Mount Rushmore of funk.
Right.
Because he laid everything out in the mid to late 60s that everybody else built on. Next, I want to get to our all-time favorite guy, Sly Stone.
Family Stone.
Yeah, Sly and the Family Stone, 1969.
Of course. And I mean, again, you talk about James Brown. Well, you can totally tell that Sly and the Family Stone was influenced by James as well. They just kind of took James's style and created their own. You had the horn influence, you had the rhythmical influence. What you had in Sly's band, which was obviously different than James, is that, he had the whole multi-gender women, men in the group, and also more of a rock influence in his music.
He has that in there. The other thing
along with soul.
The other thing I think that sets Sly apart is he did like chord progressions.
Right.
He had a traditional musical upbringing. He was educated, and he did not always embrace the vamp style of just playing one or two chords. So he did that occasionally. Obviously, things like Everyday People is taking that to the highest level, where you get one chord grooving throughout the song, and that is basically the whole song.
Right.
And that's his biggest hit ever. But you look at songs like Hot Fun in the Summertime.
Absolutely.
Fantastic chord changes. I mean, really just brilliant, the movement and the way the melodies just kind of glide over the chords. Lots of vocal hooks. So his live music was richer than James.
Yeah, without a doubt. One thing I will say as well, quite different than James, because James was pretty much the solo vocalist, of course, in his act.
A little Bobby Bird thrown
Bobby
in there.
Bird, yeah. Let's not forget Bobby Bird. Bobby Bird, he was more of like the chant, repeat.
He was a hype man.
Right, hype man for James. But for Sly's band, I think what you had is you had like realistically four different lead vocalists in that band. And they were the first to really create this, what do you call it, like alternating lead vocal styles of singing, where you had Sly singing a line, then you had Larry Graham singing a line, then you had Freddie Stone singing a line, and then you had Rose Stone singing a line. And so that really brought this interesting mixture of voices and harmonies to the music.
You had the earliest examples of that in things like My Lady and Dance to the Music. And I think, each of those first 3 albums, really, it took him to find his stride before he came out with Stand.
Right.
And Stand was definitely the masterpiece that put him on the map at the highest level in the world at that time as an artist and as a pop star, basically.
Hot Fun in the Summertime is another example of this kind of alternating lead vocal type of approach.
Yeah. So I think we can agree that he introduced a number of significant elements, not just with the music, but with the people in his band, the makeup of his band. Also, that band always came across as more of an egalitarian thing. It was more of like an equal thing, where every person was a unique character. It wasn't all about James, for instance. James was the star in his band, and the band was, his supporting cast. And even though we know their names now, maybe back in the day, not everybody knew St. Clair Pinckney. They didn't always know the individual people behind James, because James had so much star power on stage, because he was out front. He was a force of nature, and everybody else just kind of stood back. And they had their moves and everything, especially those trumpet guys. But anyway, getting back to Sly, the Stand album became known as the first real funk album all the way through.
Yes.
And another thing that we can take away from that is the dynamics of that album.
Yes.
Because whereas James would go to torch songs or, kind of schmaltzy cocktail lounge stuff sometimes to change the dynamics, Sly would stay nasty, but he would bring it down, and he had Sex Machine before James Brown had a Sex Machine.
Right.
So at the end of Stand, you have this track which is just going,
right,
and it had a in the groove pocket feel that took you down a little bit in a great way, where you could zone out to that and just chill.
Right. And here's a couple of different things to look at also. The bass, right? And we've had a segment about that before. Of course, James was the pioneer of this sort of funk movement, which, features bass. But I really think that Sly and Larry Graham obviously took this approach to bass as really almost kind of being in the forefront of the music. We'll have to thank Motown for that too, with, of course, our boy James Jamerson. But, Larry Graham, I just believe that Sly, in his songwriting approach, wanted the bass to really be prominent in the music.
And you just happen to have not only a fantastic songwriter in Sly, and a guy with a vision, conceptual vision for what the band could be, and the ability to articulate that, and also societal stuff, the message of the music. But you had a once-in-a-generation musician in Larry Graham who came up with a whole new way of playing.
Yes.
And it was the most organic thing. He used to have a duo, originally a trio, but then a duo with his mother.
Right.
And he had to cover the drums when they lost their drummer. Right. So he's, creating percussion while he's also playing chord changes with the bass.
Exactly.
And just because he was innovative enough to come up with that, Sly's music benefited from that,
really
and it became a revolution in funk music.
Yeah, it's a great point. Great point. Again, rhythm along with bass. So you got the drum and bass tandem going on, which James really again established that in the era of funk music. But it seems like Sly really took that to a whole nother level. Of course, infusing rock even into the music, which I think really made him and his band even more mainstream.
That's right. I want to move on next to our boys in Parliament Funkadelic.
Yes, of course.
So again, this incubation period from 67 to 69 is where the action was. It was where things were happening, and it was a musical revolution, not just in funk, but obviously in rock. It was just a very important time where there were live events like Woodstock. There were massive songs that came out that changed the world, and everybody was paying attention and picking up guitars in the wake of the Beatles and the hippie generation. Parliament started out as basically kind of more of a doo-wop singing group with George Clinton and his friends, based around his barbershop. He was a hairdresser, and they were on Motown briefly, but they kind of got overlooked because they were like presenting themselves as another Temptations, but they already had a Temptations at Motown, so they weren't really getting too far. They had put out I Want to Testify, which was a great single, and they had a lot of regional success with that, but eventually they bailed and got rid of the whole clean-cut doo-wop suit-wearing look and started getting freaky. So by the late 60s, you had basically what amounted to a 5-piece acid rock band, which was Funkadelic. And then you had George and his guys from the Parliaments,
soulful,
who had the soul singing, and George just became a hippie freak and just wanted to get crazy with it. He abandoned all the traditional stuff, the normal stuff, and he was infamous for performing a white sheet with no underwear, and he would let it all hang out. He would get up on tables and just be a total maniac.
The Parliaments, and Funkadelic, they really all started around the same time of Sly and the Family Stone popularity. I just feel like there was this movement of soul and rock.
It was freedom
fusing together.
It was musical freedom,
which spawned I Betcha, by Funkadelic in what, 1969 or 70?
Right. So by the time that core group of people like, Bernie Morrell, Tiki Fullwood,
Eddie Hazel,
he came fully into the group a little bit later,
Right,
but
right.
at first there was this core group of 5 guys,
Right,
plus
right.
you would tack the singers on, and they kind of sold you more on the musical group at the time. And the first Funkadelic album came out in 1970, which was a little later than the earliest Parliament recordings, which were maybe in 68, 69.
Exactly. Right.
But listening to those first 2 or 3 Funkadelic records, it really is one of those mind trips. It has a lot of delay and weird effects on it and crazy humor.
Right.
But you got classic songs like Funky Dollar Bill.
Right.
Which
right.
again
Love
it's Les Pauls through Marshalls. I mean, it's rock sounding, but it's still got the funk in there.
Right.
And most importantly, you get the development of the humor, which was the personality of those 2 groups.
Right. And then you get Maggot Brain,
Brain.
As a result
exactly.
of that.
So that's basically a straight up kind of like rock guitar solo ballad.
Right.
And, that hadn't really been done in exactly that same way before.
Right.
So all these things started making them an underground favorite. They were kind of slogging through, and they did a whole lot of albums before they had their first real big hits.
Right.
But that early pivotal period of 69 to 71, you had Free Your Mind.
Free Your Mind.
The first Funkadelic album has a iconic image, this circular thing that you should take a look at, and we won't get into any interpretation right now, but it's pretty obvious. George was always mixing politics with the scatological and the profane, and that's what makes it so funny. He never lost that. It was always he would do stuff that made him laugh, and all the other guys and girls, and it was it always makes you smile, whether you're reading the lyrics, whether you're looking at the album artwork, which is fantastic by Pedro Bell. There's just a lot of it's all so organic and weird.
I mean, he was definitely risque back then for that time period, but during that time period, there was a lot of freedom of expression going on. I think not just with Parliament, but Sly and all the other groups during that time.
Yeah, and some of the stuff that George did live in front of an audience was the same stuff that got Jim Morrison, arrested. And he had to go through a major trial. He almost did hard time for what happened to him in '68 in Florida. I mean, so I mean, George got super lucky because he did worse stuff. So there's just a rich history of George pushing the limits and then going beyond that, and the stories are legendary. I highly recommend his biography, his autobiography.
Absolutely, great read.
A lot of it is about his legal troubles and the issues he had with his band, and he owns up to all the things that he did where maybe they were not quite on the up and up. But he lived that life, and it's really interesting to hear about it now.
Absolutely.
All right, let's move on. Our last pick today for the Mount Rushmore of Funk is Tower Power. And there are many great bands that made their mark, and we certainly love them all. But as far as being at the kind of the inception, which you have to kind of look at the 67 to 69 period. So Tower Power formed in 68. The first album came out in 69. And to me, that was a shift from the James Brown influence, but it took it up a notch. Because Tower Power had a cast of musicians that is second to none.
Absolutely
incredible rhythm section, legendary. You had David Garibaldi on drums. You had Rocco Prestillo on bass. Who anybody that plays bass, Rocco is definitely one of the all-time legends of playing the bass. And what he brought to it was a type of 16th note finger funk, where he wasn't doing slap and pop like Larry, because when he started, that wasn't even a thing yet. Larry started that, but Rocco's thing was fast, 16th notes, and it would blow your mind to hear his fluency in that.
Which is something that really hadn't been done before. As far as the approach to playing bass.
Jamerson obviously had complexity, incredibly rich complexity in what he was doing in Motown, but James was the star of the Funk Brothers in Motown. He he did mostly what he wanted to, but he also had to listen to producers and the songwriters and everybody else that molded him to be what they want.
Right.
Rocco was the part of a band, and it was he was a product of the hippie generation, and he had carte blanche to do whatever the hell he wanted to do.
Right.
So you're hearing stuff that a lot of producers in Motown would have considered probably overkill.
Right.
And by the time they had their massive breakthrough in '73 with What Is Hip
Right.
and that self-titled Tower Power album,
Right.
his style was fully realized. But even early on, the first record,
Right.
you're getting, incredible parts. You're getting songs, things like Soul Vaccination. Later on, you're getting, Down to the Nightclub.
Right.
This stuff
Right.
is incredibly funky. And
Yeah.
it's all driven by the bass.
I would even mention too, in some of Tower Power's earlier works, even before that, those tunes, you talk about like 1970, where they not only did they have the musicianship, but they were extremely, extremely soulful. Just another quick note about Tower Power, I would say maybe the first couple of albums, like 1970, they really demonstrated the ability to be soulful as well. You're talking about several guys in that group that had great voices and were just, really on top of their vocal harmonization.
Yeah.
Where, of course, you have the great musicianship, but also the heartfelt vocals and harmonies as well.
They always had that. There
Yeah.
were two sides of a coin. They had
Right.
the super funk stuff, driven by Rocco and
Right.
David Garibaldi. And then you had the soul balladry. You had You're Still a Young Man.
Exactly.
So Very Hard to Go.
Yes.
I mean, just
absolutely.
it goes on and on. They
Yeah.
had so many fantastic, Don't Change Horses in the Middle of a Stream.
Right. Yeah, right.
You always have the funkier side and the sweet side, the
Right.
soul side.
Good point.
And they were probably the best
point.
band to balance that out that ever was. They could do it all. They always had a fantastic lead singer.
Right.
Wasn't the same guy all the time. Every couple of years he would leave
Yeah.
to be somebody else.
Absolutely.
But they always had a great lead singer,
Right.
which continues to this day. But the other guys in the band, including the leader of the band, Emilio Castillo,
Right.
who was the principal sax player, he was a great singer. Still
Right.
is a great singer.
Right.
So he would sing a lot of the songs,
Right.
and he would drive all those great soulful backup vocals. So by the time they had their breakthrough with What Is Hip, they were playing, major festivals. They were
Right.
playing with rock bands. They were certainly one of the bigger bands in the country, if not the world.
Right.
And they were kind of moving towards that crucial year of '75, where
Right.
funk was really at its peak, right before it fell off the disco cliff and everything
Right.
got weird.
Talk about that album from 75, which you turned me on to.
Yeah, In the Slot.
Yes.
Yeah, so In the Slot's got Ebony Jam, which is a 6-minute long instrumental. It always just strikes me as percolating. It's got this gurgling, chugging feeling to it, where all the instruments are locked in together, and you're really hearing a band play
Right.
as a band.
Right.
It's not that one guy's doing everything and
Right.
everybody else is just kind of slacking off.
Right.
Everybody is participating in that and makes it what it is.
Absolutely.
They always had great guitar playing. Everything's great about that band. So you can go right down the checklist, and it's a great listen.
Yeah, and it also didn't really matter. They really had quite a few lead singers. It was almost like a revolving door with that band with lead singers, but it didn't matter because they managed to still put out great music no matter who was singing lead in that band at the time.
And what's amazing is that Tower Power is still on the road. They've basically been on the road since the 60s.
Right.
And they're still touring
Right.
the world. Of course, there's only maybe 2 or 3 original guys, but
Right.
they're still holding the flame going.
Absolutely.
And P-Funk is still out there doing
Yeah.
it. Even though George had said he was going to retire, he's in his 80s now. But they're still out there doing it right
He's
now.
had 5 retirement tours in the last 10 years. But
the demand is there. He's an icon
absolutely.
now. So at this point, he's just basically taking a victory lap every time he goes out on tour and bringing that music to new generations of people, which is the best thing there could be, because everybody should be checking that music out.
Yeah, I've had the privilege of seeing Parliament Funkadelic over in my lifetime, many years. I saw him twice in LA. I saw him like 4 or 5 times in Arizona.
Yeah, I've seen him too. It's a great experience.
Right.
But the thing is, they're documented on film and recordings for their classic live concert tour.
Yes.
From the 76 to 77 era,
Yeah.
the Mothership era,
Yeah,
when they had those
good
massive hits and they took out this huge production with the spaceship and the
Right.
crazy costumes.
Right.
So that is really the peak that will live on for P-Funk for all time, because that was when they were at their height.
One of the all-time great jam bands, right? I mean, their jams can literally go on for half an hour, but that's what the audience digs about their live performances.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we can even use the Grateful Dead. I know they're not in this conversation, but you talk about live performances where bands would just stretch out on one song for like 20 minutes.
Well, see, that was it. That's the perfect marriage. They had the heavy funk rhythm,
Right.
Whatever that was for whatever particular song, it was funky. And then you had wailing guitar on top of it,
Right.
whether it was Eddie
Right.
Hazel or
Right.
Scheider or Blackbird McKnight was
Right.
playing with them for a
Yeah.
while. Went on
Good
to play with
point.
Herbie as well.
Yeah.
I mean, you had just a whole cast of fantastic musicians,
Right.
dozens and dozens, sometimes on the
Ski.
stage at the same time.
I mean, Cordell Mawson, of course, Bootsy Collins, but yeah, Jimmy Morrison. So
yeah, it's a rich history, and so many of the artists that played with P-Funk over the years went off to do their own thing, start other bands, join other bands. So
Right.
there's a huge family tree, a big legacy that's worth exploring. But the wellspring, got to go back to James. It always starts with James,
Right.
and then a lot of the principal players from later years came from him, from having played with him. People like Fred Wesley and
Right.
Bootsy.
Right.
It's this great lineage. It's a big family. All right. Well, thanks for hanging out with us today. We'll see you next time on This Funkin' Life. Please check out our Patreon page below for all kinds of exclusive content from our band Calumet. We have live concert clips, there's photos, unreleased songs, and more. We really appreciate your support.